It was a wonderful time. My poetry was becoming performance art at that point. I was working with a very close friend who remains a close friend of mine, David Bickness. He started doing sort of jazz improvisation behind the poetry that I would then. I began to write things not for poetry on the page, but for performance poetry, something that I could do live in a live situation. And pretty soon, that jazz and poetry really turned into more theatrical performance art, where I was no longer writing poetry at all. I was writing scenarios and stories and all kinds of other things that were completely removed from the old poetry paradigm. This was the age of performance art. This is when performance art began rearing its ugly head, and David and I were kind of doing our version of it at Madison at that point. Continued to do that for about 5 or 6 years. And the first pieces we did were at Gallery 853. During that tenure while I was at 853, I began to experiment with writing art criticism, which I later parlayed into an actual job in Chicago in 1980 as an art critic and editor. These were formative years for me. During that time, I had gone to graduate school, never got my degree. After graduate school, I was working in a daycare center. I was delivering pizzas. I was driving cab, doing all these things to make money to support my artistic habit, my artistic goal of being a writer of some kind. I mean, poetry I would never make. I eventually figured out that writing about art, and specifically visual art, as I've been exposed to so many artists at Gallery 853, that was a huge education for me. I pretty much became self-taught in art history and contemporary art, and that was really my springboard to a career as an arts writer. Now, Mama, ultimately there's another article takeover called Mama Slipped on a Crack and Broke Her Back. This was December 1977. What this really heralded was the end of Mama. It was the result, and I'm very murky about this stuff, that really caused the problem, but it seemed to be sort of a rift between two different cliques or two different groups within Gallery 850. One of those groups was Dan Yopak and his group of poets and artists, and the other side was a group that joined up with ARW, the Artist Research Workshop, called Wisconsin Institute for Intermediate Study, headed up by Chaz Moore. And this group seemed to be, from my recollection and memory, very much involved with video documentation of the art, and they were very much a technological group of people. And Chaz was sort of used to running his own organization, but folded into 853, he became part of a larger group. And really, either a rift developed, or there never ever a really solid democratic melding of the two, because ultimately it was like oil on water. They just didn't mix. It never gelled. It never happened. In the end, of course, the problem with money and rent and who was going to pay for what became, I think, one of the pivotal points of its demise. For me, I remember reading sort of a semi-resignation letter that I wrote, and it was kind of a plea to continue to work together, but at the same time, I mentioned that myself and Lucine Fulgueras, who I think came in with WIIS, both she and I believe somebody else, were deciding to go and actually find a real paying job. At that point, we kind of felt like we had put in our not-for-profit years, and we're about ready to start moving on with our lives and our careers. Around 1977, I took a job with the Madison Art Center, which is now Madison Art Museum. At that point, it was located over on Gorham Avenue on the lake, and I got a job there as a arts publicist. I was the publicity director. From there, I was able to start publishing in the Capital Times, Wisconsin State Journal, with a byline. Even though I was a publicist, they didn't have enough arts writers on staff, and they welcomed anybody who could sort of do something beyond a press release, which I could do. I would craft special articles about the Art Museum, the Art Center, for them. That was my foot in the door of big-time publishing in terms of like legitimate journalism. I did that from 1977 to 1980. Gradually started freelancing with other publications. I had written for Midwest Art out of Milwaukee for a while, but that sort of bit the dust. And then I began writing for a Chicago publication by the name of New Art Examiner, and representing Wisconsin, but eventually they would call me down to cover things in Chicago, and I struck up a relationship with them, and when they decided to go national, they brought me into Chicago as a bureau chief. And at that point, I moved out of Madison in 1980 and moved back to my hometown, Chicago.